Welcome to Psychologist Talks. On today's episode, we're going to talk about dissociation and, by proxy, dissociative identity disorder. Now, like most of my diagnostic-esque series, I'm not going to just roll through all the diagnostic criteria. Instead, I like to telescope out and talk more holistically about the condition. To me, the variables or the components that are actually most key and most critical to understanding what we're talking about. With dissociative identity disorder, or DID, what's most important is understanding dissociative experiences just in general. DID, I think, is so misunderstood. One, we haven't done a terribly good service, even as professionals, by history. But we become so hyper-fixated on this sort of exciting, very severe condition that we lose scope and we lose the sort of vision of what the continuum actually is. That dissociative experiences exist on this massive continuum before we ever get to DID. And like all things in life, to understand what an extreme is, we need to understand everything that comes before it. Otherwise, we risk creating a caricature out of it. And within that caricature, we can either shun it and stigmatize it and thereby not understand it, or we can over-embellish and overindulge it. And I think that we're dangerously close to that right now, that we've moved away pretty successfully from stigmatizing this too much, but we've destigmatized it in a way that I think just it's creating a little bit of a caricature, and it's misused and misappropriated, rather than appreciating that a lot of these people who think that they're somewhere close to that could exist somewhere else on this continuum. So let me briefly define it, then I'll just talk about this continuum. That's literally all I'm doing today, is just rolling through the continuum, and hopefully it'll be helpful. So dissociation, switch between dissociation and dissociative experiences. If like the simplest of definition, it is the failure to consciously internalize and encode something that's happened around us. Maybe somebody would slap me for that definition. I don't know. But to me, it's just the easiest way to think of it. Because we're constantly processing anything around us. Whether we like it or not, our brains are perfectly attuned to processing lots of things. And dissociative experience says there's some component of that, or almost completely, we ain't going to process. And this is kind of alluding to the normal range here. To what degree? I will note, the dissociative process, I think a simple way to divide it is dissociation can think more from like an encoding memory perspective. We'll talk about that in one regard. And then we'll talk about dissociation of self. So like a fragmentation of self, like awareness or less awareness or no awareness of parts of self. Now, these two are coexisting. This is kind of in tandem with one another, but I'll try to describe both as we go along this normal range of like memory and encoding versus self states. So let's start with like the most basic, like just the 101, we all dissociate. I think this is always a good thing to review. The most common and benign of examples, I think accessible to many, is if you've ever traveled a long distance, somewhere that you've traveled or some method that you've traveled frequently, whether you yourself are doing the traveling and driving or whatever it might be, or someone else is driving and you're just kind of a passenger, you can get from point A to point B and have very little memory of it. Now, I can guarantee you're processing it, and the evidence to that is if you're the driver, say if you're driving a car from work to home, you had to have been processing something, or else you would have immediately crashed your car. And this is the beauty of the human brain, is that when something is more familiar, when something has been tried many times, we can actually push out of conscious awareness, encoding what is unique to that particular time. Again, dissociative experiences, like I said, it runs the gamut. It's usually used a little bit more clinically than that, but it, to me, technically constitutes the most normal range of it all, that we don't consciously attend it. The other examples are, our ability to dissociate physiologically, that there are, sensations constantly going through our bodies that our brain is processing, but we're not always consciously aware of it because it says, I don't need to do this. I can push this out of conscious awareness. I mean, I can tend to all this clothing that I'm wearing if I really focus in and go like, oh, I have all this stuff, and that actually start making me anxious, right? Because I'm like, oh gosh, that's so uncomfortable, all this stuff on me. But our body says like, hey, it's cool. I know what this is. You don't need to worry about it. You got bigger fish to fry. It's a really important skill set, because if we were incapable of doing this in any way, we'd be incredibly primal life forms. We couldn't ever get to the next level because we'd always be processing these really small things and over-attending to something that, doesn't need to be over-attended to. Now, a really important caveat in everything I'm just saying is there is habituation that we're talking about. So this isn't like a new or novel stimuli. When something is very new and novel, we tend to have a hard time not focusing and encoding quite a bit of it, because that's a survival mechanism. If something is new and unfamiliar, what is this? I'm going to attend to it. I'm going to process it and figure out what it is, and then I can kind of dissociate from the experience. But again, just illustrating the power of the human mind. Now we start heading towards stress and distress. A good example that most people could probably identify with vicariously is, say, if you've ever seen somebody or know somebody, or maybe you have been in a car accident. Sometimes for some people, they will have very distinct memories of everything that will happen. Other times people will not, because it was just so overwhelming for the system. It's, we were processing. There was something going on there. We're just like, cut. Like, we're not going to remember that part because that was too much, or I got really hurt and there was a lot of pain, or there was intense, overwhelming fear in that moment, and I didn't know what to do with that. So goodbye, right? Goodbye. Another example is for those held at gunpoint. Very scary. My apologies. I'm not trying to make it overtly scary, but the power of the human mind to be like, what am I going to do? There's the dissociative process of like just barely remembering the event in of itself. But what's really interesting too is there's sometimes certain stimuli can be so commanding that while there's all this other sensory information coming in and we're processing it to a certain degree, because subliminal subtle processing does occur. The studies where they flash something in front of somebody's eyes, they're not consciously aware of what they just saw yet, boom, encoded in memory. What's really interesting, some people can describe the gun and the person and everything else. Some people will only remember the gun, and everything else is gone, because it just hyperfixates on the threat, the most important piece of the threat, which is the gun at hand, and thereby the brain is dissociating from other sensory experiences that were commanding some degree of attention. Now, none of this might be terribly helpful. I'm just trying to illustrate how kind of wide-ranging this can be. Now, when we're getting into the traditional use of the word, this is where we're getting closer to this idea of like something we're having a hard time encoding, and or we're somewhat increasingly fragmented because of distress, duress, or some sort of anxiety. So from a memory standpoint, let's go down this road. Once again, most accessible to many, many people. If you've ever had an extremely stressful period in your life, good or bad, not to put judgment words on it, but I mean, we're not just talking about you're going through a divorce or there was a death in the family or anything. It could be like getting married, having a kid, whatever it might be. During those times of duress, we're feeling overwhelmed. Some people, they'll have excellent memories of those experiences. Others might not, because they get into kind of a fight or flight survival mode and go, okay, well, I don't know what to do with all this emotion. It's a little bit too much, so I'm going to be partially here. Like, I can feel the feelings. I will tell you how I'm feeling, but I'm not really encountering the emotion as fully as I could be, because I'm trying to just survive and get through the day. I need to get this work done. I need to get this test done, da-da-da-da. And by proxy of doing that, our memories can become less distinct. And once again, there's a survival component to it, but there's also a little bit of sadness to it too, that the emotion or the activation becomes just dangerous enough that we're like not going to encode it as much as we should, which, should's a strong word, but it can be sad, especially when it's like a really productive or really interesting time in our life. And a few years later, we look back and go, oh, geez, like I remember parts of it. I remember the gist of it. I remember this piece, but like there's also gaps. Now, let me be clear. When we go into our more distant past, particularly childhood, it's not atypical that people have varying degrees of memories. So just because you have holes in your memory from childhood doesn't mean there's some latent secret trauma floating around in there. Could there be? Always could be. But, we're allowed to have various degrees of like conscious processing. I've met people whose memories are so immensely distinct. And this is, you could extract every stress and depression piece out of my body, and I'm telling you, biologically I would not have the same memory as these people. Just fantastic, phenomenal, and highly detailed memories. I mean, kudos to them. That just ain't me. So do be clear, there is a normal range outside of any possible dissociative experience when it comes to degree and sort of depth of memory, especially when we talk about childhood and adolescence. And the more distinct, the more distal, the more distant we get from whatever the memory is. That being said, under duress and increasing duress, we're getting towards adversity and especially trauma. That's where memory can be compromised. Now let's go the similar route with self states. Self states, very simply put, is just, we have an organizing sense of self. And this sense of self is constantly comparing and contrasting to various experiences, people, and systems. And we're internalizing all this stuff. And we're also noticing our behavior and when certain triggers lead to certain emotions and all this other stuff. And we're creating this really complex web. Or think of it like a solar system inside of us with all these different planets. They're all part of the same solar system. They are all technically related in some sort of way. They're all revolving around the sun. But we're not always aware of all of them, either because they are not frequently used, or they're defended against because we don't like them, or they were shamed in some sort of way. And this is all very normal. You go to my personality episodes, like most of us are neurotic to a certain degree. And you know where that neurosis comes from? Fragmentation from self states. Most typically there's some aspect of functioning. It's just like, oh, danger, I don't know what to do with that. And so we dissociate from it. We push it away. And that does not mean we have dissociative identity disorder, right? Like, this is normal range. This is what people often are coming to see me for, is like, I'm sitting there helping them observe their solar system to become a better astronomer and say, like, you're ignoring the outer rim planets, or there's this planet right next to you and you seem to be like not at all tending to it. So how are we going to bring increasing conscious awareness and understanding of it, and then integrate it more and understand its role in the solar system? This happens all the time. So, when people come in and like, yeah, I dissociate some. I'm not like, oh no, right? I'm like, okay, interesting. Let me hear what that means to you, because it could just be this. Now, as duress increases and as traumas especially increase in our life, the risk for not knowing much of the solar system increases exponentially. And importantly, it's not just about the self, remember, it's also about the world around us. And we can also have dissociative experiences of the world around us. We stop encoding and really more richly understanding certain types of people or certain, systems, because they are seen as unsafe or too unpredictable. And so our representations of other people in the world and systems can also become compromised. So anything that's unsafe or seen as aggressive or whatever just becomes more chaotic. Just like it's a mess of things. I don't know, there's a planet in there that feels like there's meters everywhere and they're just going to hit my spaceship at any time, or I can't look there. Maybe there's an alien life form that's going to take me over. I can't do it. And this is as we're kind of incrementally getting closer, right? There's lots of the other conditions, though. There's personality disorders floating around here. Remember, I talked about there's a huge range. It's not like you have a disorder, you don't. Personality issues, severe, protracted depression, extreme anxiety conditions. There's often some fragmentation of self within that. I mean, there's lots of potential room here before we're even getting to dissociative disorders. Also, the reason why PTSD by itself has a dissociative subtype or a specifier added to it, because you can do that before you get to DID. That with significant trauma, having a dissociative component is not altogether uncommon. Does it happen all the time? No. But, remember, the diagnostic manual is also kind of a little bit all or nothing. It implies you either have the components or you don't. Or, we're only remarking upon it if it's a more serious or severe defense. So they're coming along here. And as we are now getting into like PTSD, especially complex trauma, and now into the dissociative identity disorders, which they are not numerous, but basically like an other specified versus a, true blue distinct. We've got true lapses in memory. We're talking severe lapses in memory, complete losses in time. Not like, well, I can vaguely piece things together. I kind of got these pieces. Those things can happen with trauma and stuff. But you get towards DID and they're just gone. I mean, there's just lapses in time. They're just like, I have zero idea what happened there. No conscious recollection. The solar system has been rotating around the sun, and all of a sudden the planets are in different locations. Or from a self-state perspective, it's just like, I don't know, I could have sworn I was Earth, but now I'm on Saturn. And that's assuming they're even aware that there was a shift between Saturn and Earth. Sometimes the very severe DID cases, they're not really consciously aware of these shifts between planets, and they don't even see it as a solar system. Oh, I'm on a different planet. Okay, this is what I do on this planet. And this is why, certain way I operate here, and over here in this planet, different way of operating. But when we're getting to this level of severity, the self-state's massively fragmented, and the awareness and conscious processing is so fragmented, it is, to me, unequivocally paired with severe, significant trauma, typically childhood trauma, the most formative years of self, the identity development. There is severe trauma. So you're not going to get a DID case just because you're stressed or something new has come up in your life. That's not how that works. It is linked to severe protracted traumas from childhood. I guess I should say it could be a severe singular trauma. Like we're talking, something their jaws would drop kind of hearing sort of thing. Or, it could be less severe but still significant, but repeated and protracted traumas can also do this, because maybe the first few times they were exposed, it didn't quite fragment, but the incremental and repeated exposures, the defenses, just get to be bigger and bigger because they're like, we can't do this. I don't know what to do with this. There's no escape. There's no control. And fragmentation begins to take hold over time, not necessarily immediately. So hopefully that's helpful. That there is this huge continuum upon which we can exist when we talk about dissociative experiences, whether it's losing track of time, the sort of dissociative amnesia component of dissociative conditions and dissociative experiences, to dissociation of self, the fragmentation and less familiarity with one's internal and external solar systems. And that, as things get worse and as we get more traumas and adversities, and especially if there are repeated severe childhood traumas, we were getting closer and closer to those more traditionally understood clinical, more severe labelings of dissociation and thereby dissociative identity disorder eventually at the end, the whole way at the end of the spectrum. At the end of the day, the cool thing is so much of it is about grounding and an ability to observe oneself. Very severe cases, you need to teach somebody how to ground just to feel safe enough to even experience anything. But even us, somewhere in the normal range, just grounding and actually attending to ourselves, like being willing to sit with some sort of discomfort is a challenge, but a very important thing for us all to learn. That's why the mindfulness movement has really taken over the last several decades in our field, to be more mindful and intentional about one's awareness of self and others in the world around them in any given day, because we are dissociating our life half the time. I mean, the internet and the world and news and everything is like, oh my gosh, there's too much. It can be absolutely overwhelming. And so we're losing touch with ourselves. And so that grounding component is incredibly important. And then from there, we can observe ourselves and learn about ourselves better and become better astronomers. We can learn our internal worlds much better. We can observe the planets as they go, not incessantly, right? But we're like, oh, it's Pluto again. Welcome back. I'm still not sure if that's a planet or not. Literally, I'm not sure if that's a planet or not. Welcome back. I at least observe you. I know you're there. And every once in a while I'll be like, I still don't know you, but I'm willing to look. And I know to look. And from that, we become increasingly intentional, increasingly cohesive with ourselves, and it leads to better outcomes in our lives. That's the journey for us all. It is. To do this type of work, you don't have to be diagnosed with DID. You don't have to be diagnosed with PTSD with dissociative features. anybody can benefit from this process to varying degrees depending on your unique experiences of dissociation, but it's accessible to all. So I hope that's helpful. I hope by proxy that helps with like differential, or if you're concerned about having multiple personalities yourself, maybe that helps you put yourself somewhere on this map. Or if you're a provider and you have people who come in and complain of this, because I know it does happen, hopefully this is helpful in the sense of like, hey, where would I put people on this continuum? How can I even describe this from a more continuum based notion? And do understand, as a provider, that we have lots of language, and we're horrible in this field. We have lots of different language for the same experience. Like if you're more of a CBT clinician, welcome to schema therapy, right? That's self states, internal family system, parts of self, right? There's lots of same stuff, just different words. So it's a universal issue. We need to take the serious ones very seriously. But again, I'm just repeating myself. Hopefully it's helpful to hear more of a continuum-based understanding. So at least my understanding of it. As ever, I appreciate you for listening and watching. I hope it's been helpful. And as always, stay curious.